Thank you very much indeed, and thanks also to Bryan, who it was a real pleasure to work with in the kind of the BP days, and also to continue our kind of relationship in the present time. It's also great to see a number of former geological colleagues. I'm a geologist by background. I'm not a strategic planner by background. I'm not sure quite what that is, but it's been my pleasure to be working in BP for the last 30 years or so. Initially as an exploration geologist and then moving into various commercial and operational roles. But what I'd like to do is really talk a little bit more about, if you like, the broader context for the energy challenge, what we call the dual challenge. And I think a number of you will have heard from my colleague Spencer Dale, who's our group chief economist, about the nature of this challenge. And Spencer, as I'm sure he will have trailed, will be releasing BP's new version of the energy outlook in mid-February. So I'm not going to front-run some of the things that he's going to say, because that should hopefully be a frisson of excitement for that period of time. But what we try and encapsulate the challenge here for society and for the planet is around the dual energy challenge. It's society's need for more energy, not simply because we're going to have 2 billion more people in the next couple of decades on the planet, because those people are wanting to move from lower to middle incomes. And to allow that prosperity to develop actually requires energy. So under any circumstances, be it the Paris Agreement, or be it something that looks more like the nationally determined contributions, the pledges that individual countries pledged at Paris, the demand for energy looks like it's going to grow between 20 and 30% between now and 2040. The other side of the equation, quite clearly, is what we have great concerns about and is concerning a lot of people in Davos at the moment, is around lower greenhouse gas emissions. And if we stick with Paris just below 2 degrees, by 2040, we have to reduce emissions by about 50%. If we look at 1.5 degrees, that actually brings that challenge forward by a decade, which means we have to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. So however you look at the percentages, the increasing demand for energy, particularly for developmental purposes, balanced out with the imperative to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, is without doubt one of the kind of challenges of our time. And that's an important context, because often when we talk about this, we see the conversation either biased to kind of one side of the equation or the other. And what we've tried to do through the work we've done internally, and also I hope you will have seen, as of last night, BP's new advertising campaign. First time we've done it for kind of 10 years, mainly for obvious reasons after the Gulf of Mexico tragedy. But we're really trying to get our kind of mojo back and kind of lean into this energy transition, but be mindful of both sides of the equation. Again, Spencer may have shown this to you, but I just want to, it's a busy chart, but as Bryan describes, I think we need to kind of be fact-based and quite thoughtful about the way we think about things as kind of scientists and as geologists. And what this chart tries to do is to kind of set out the nature of the challenge in a fairly stark way, but also conduct a few sensitivities around, for example, if we banned the internal combustion engine, what difference would that make? For example, if we just gave renewables a push but ignored decarbonisation elsewhere, what difference would that make? And so on the left-hand side of the chart, what you can see is the 2016 primary energy demand from a number of different sources. So we go from oil in light green through to gas, through to coal, nuclear, hydro and renewables. And we know that renewables are growing at an absolute phenomenal rate, faster than any other primary energy source in history, and they amount to about 4% of primary energy at the moment. So then let's take ourselves out to 2040, and you've got these 6 different scenarios. So the first one, known as the ET, or the Evolving Transition, is broadly equivalent to the country NDCs that were pledged at Paris. And that gives you a temperature rise of somewhere between 2.7 and 3.5 degrees centigrade. So it is off the mark in terms of the Paris Agreement. Then if you go to the far side of that chart, you see a thing rather inelegantly called the EFT, the Even Faster Transition. And it was called this because the year previously we had a thing called the FT, called the Faster Transition, and this is even faster. Spencer has promised that for the energy outlook this year, it's going to be kind of resolved into a slightly less complex language. But to all intents and purposes, the EFT is essentially the kind of Paris Agreement. It's kind of our interpretation of those Paris goals. And you can see the stack of technologies that will be required to deliver that. Oil and gas will kind of retain about 40% of of production in 2040. And that's quite an important point. It's not that oil and gas will disappear off the map anytime soon. Now, by the time we get out to kind of 2060, then that percentage becomes much more kind of diminished, absent very, very significant CCUS and kind of other forms of CO2 abatement. The other important points from that EFT scenario, i.e. the Paris scenario, is that coal clearly diminishes in the mix and renewables grows to be 30% of primary energy. So you've got renewables going very substantially into power, and it may be that we even translate some kind of renewables into renewable heat as well. So that is the kind of the size of the challenge. And even under the ET scenario, the kind of more steady as she goes NDC scenario, renewables will actually grow to form 15% of primary energy. And again, that's faster than any energy source has ever grown in the history of mankind. Then what we did was to conduct these to a series of different kind of sensitivities. Now, I'll just call out a couple that I think are quite interesting because this is an important point for policymakers. So if you look at a thing called the ICE ban, which is called the ICE internal combustion engine ban. So what we did was to conduct a thought experiment, which was to say, what if we, as of 2040, there were no further pure internal combustion engine vehicles on the planet? Everything had to be some form of kind of hybrid. So these are light vehicles and sort of medium-duty trucks. What difference would that make? Well, what's quite interesting is that clearly it would make a difference to oil demand, and you can see the green bar under the ICE ban actually shrinking somewhat. Would it make a big difference to emissions? Because we hear a lot about the use of electric vehicles to actually kind of reduce emissions. And the reality is, if we take a look at that, you look at the ICE ban, which is this light green thing here, and you see the impact on CO2 emissions versus the kind of the steady as she goes evolving transition is relatively modest. So banning the internal combustion engine for light-duty vehicles will have some great air quality impacts. There's no doubt about that. But it's not going to have a huge and dramatic impact on CO2 emissions, not least because light-duty vehicle transportation only makes up about 20 to 25 million barrels a day of oil demand. The other interesting point, we did a thing called renewables push, which is to bias a lot of policy just towards putting renewables in the ground. And of course, that does make quite a difference. You can see the kind of the lilac chart there. But it doesn't make enough difference to bend the curve right down to meet the Paris goals. And so the conclusion from this is this has got to be an all-of-the-above approach. This has got to include decarbonisation across a wide range of technologies, including renewables, and also CCS will have to play its part. Decarbonised gas, for example, a future for hydrogen is going to be extremely important in our view. As well as a selective use of kind of biomass. But then with biomass, we do have the challenges of food versus fuel. So a focus on kind of waste biomass would seem to be the most appropriate. So again, very much all of the above solution to decarbonisation. So the other point that I think is worth making if we take a kind of a long-run view of the fuel mix is that if we take ourselves back to the turn of the previous century, you can see that there was a single dominant fuel. And that's sort of been the case, certainly in the kind of the 1960s when oil started to kind of rule the roost. But as we get out to really this period now to the 2040s, what we're seeing is a diversified fuel mix with huge amounts of fuel-to-fuel competition. Now that has got to be a good thing, particularly as we're biasing towards kind of lower carbon, lower emissions fuel technologies. That actually starts to ensure that kind of renewables get their kind of fair share of market penetration. So a very competitive fuel mix going into the future. And what's also quite interesting is that the relative abundance of energy on the planet is now even greater than it has been. Now, clearly back in the 80s and 90s, we were talking about peak oil. We were talking about peak oil from a supply side. That clearly has gone off the equation entirely, and it's now more about peak oil from the demand side. There is more than enough oil in the world to kind of satisfy mankind's needs. And there's an awful lot of oil in the world that will not see the light of day and shouldn't do so. So a couple of other things I'd like to quickly add before getting onto the specifics of how BP is approaching this is the technology outlook. And some of you, I hope, were able to participate in the release of our technology outlook by our chief technologist, David Eiton, last year, where we spent a lot of time looking at different technologies, and noticing kind of what has changed and what's not. So very quickly, lower battery costs. We used to do battery surveys every kind of year or two. That's completely pointless. You actually need to do it on a continuous basis. Battery costs are coming down, and we think that battery costs will come down to the levels of $100 to $200 per kilowatt hour, making the internal combustion engine and electric vehicles actually what's called lot parity. So you go to the garage and you're making a choice about the technology, not necessarily a choice about the kind of the headline price. That's happening very, very soon. Again, we know all about this lower solar and wind cost, the kind of phenomenal driving down in costs for solar and wind. And just to look back, and including offshore wind, if we look back at some of the early UK offshore wind auctions, we're looking at kind of £140 per megawatt hour. Most recently, it's been £52 per megawatt hour. So these kind of changes are kind of quite remarkable. And then more substantially in the oil and gas space, the high performance of unconventional reservoirs, notably in the US, notably with the kind of rebirth of the kind of Permian Basin unconventionals. And the things that we actually have not changed from our perspective is this kind of the abundance of energy resources. We're not going to run out anytime soon. The comparative ease of power sector decarbonisation. And that's where, again, if Spencer was here, he'd be talking about if we want to take the kind of the big steps into decarbonisation, it has to be kind of power in the first instance. And then finally, the rapid evolution of digital technology, which I think will create greater sort of customer choice around energy going into the future, and also ease the, if you like, kind of both lifting costs and costs of supply for a range of different energy types. So just to highlight a few of those, and this is particularly relevant to a geological audience. So if we look at that kind of middle kind of ellipse there, this is the range of oil and gas demand to 2050 under a Paris scenario and under, if you like, an NDC scenario. So that's the range of what will be required under those charts I showed you a little bit earlier. But then if you look at the kind of the total abundance of both technically recoverable reserves, potential for new discoveries, and increased recovery from better technologies, you can see that what's available absolutely kind of overlaps and dwarfs what's required. And in particular, what's required under Paris. And so the potential oil and gas resources are abundant. That means there's going to be more resource-to-resource competition within oil and gas, which will kind of progressively drive the costs down and make extraction increasingly efficient. But again, if we take all the kind of reserves that are kind of out there in the world that have been declared, particularly by countries, it's highly unlikely that much more than about half of that will actually ever see the light of day. The second point is around kind of power decarbonisation, and we've seen a lot of great sort of competition now coming into the power sector as we've seen technologies evolve. And these coloured charts represent where we think kind of, if you like, the kind of the pecking order for power generation will be come 2050. The reality is that I think this is going to become more like 2035 as we're seeing costs go down lower and lower all the time. And so and what we've also tried to do is to incorporate on these charts a thing that we've been quite concerned about, which is the cost of intermittency, because of course the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time. So what is the additional cost required to actually bind onshore wind into a kind of a system where there's available backup? So we've done some estimates of 40% of generation to 75% of generation from these individual technologies. And what you can see is actually the cost of intermittency is going down all the time. The ability to predict wind, the ability to kind of predict solar, and the integration within mature grids means that, and this is based on the US grids on average. We can see that these intermittency costs are relatively modest for onshore wind. We're quite surprised they're rather higher for solar, which in general will be more predictable. So within all of this, our kind of point of view is that onshore wind is likely to be the kind of the winner. Gas plus CCS, if you assume a carbon price of $100 per tonne around this time, will be effective. Existing gas, again, this is a big lump of that is going to be carbon price. And then as we go through the card, I mean, my view is that solar PV is probably being dealt a poorer hand here, and it is probably going to come down the cost curve more quickly as we're seeing at the moment. But you can see it's these kind of technologies that we think are going to be the kind of the winning way. Similarly with offshore wind, again, this is US based, and if the learning curve experiences in the US are the same in the North Sea, we'll see these costs coming down very rapidly. But what we do see at the back end here is coal with CCS and existing coal and nuclear are likely to be the less successful kind of power generation technologies, not least because nuclear, apart from China, and with the exception of what seemed to be pretty good progress in Hinkley Point, we're seeing real challenges in kind of nuclear cost reductions, China being the exception, where they're building about 1 gigawatt nuclear every month and are getting learning curve effects from that. So that's a little bit on the kind of the power side. If we look at transport, some very interesting, and this chart is interesting because kind of everything sort of looks the same by the time you get out to about 2050. And again, we think that's going to happen probably sooner. And so the likely kind of winning way is going to be kind of battery electric vehicles. But what is remarkable about this is that costs are converging in the light-duty transport sector. So across all of these different technologies, we're likely to see lot parity coming quite soon. And the choice you then make is actually on the kind of utility of the vehicle. Can you charge it? What's the kind of range? And we're seeing really big advances in that across the industry at the moment. So what does that all mean for kind of BP when we start to think about the range of different kind of outcomes that could emerge, and the range of different outcomes that could emerge under Paris alone? Again, without front-running our energy outlook too much, what we will be doing is try and kind of describe a range of different scenarios that are actually consistent with the Paris goals. And you can see some of those scenarios start to kick off with massive reductions sooner rather than later. And then you have other scenarios, for example, the shale sky scenario, where you back-end load a lot of the kind of CO2 reductions, particularly with BECCS. Now, so what we want to do, and our strategic kind of priorities are simply stated as ensuring that our strategy is flexible to a range of outcomes. So this isn't a single deterministic view of the world, which actually makes my job in planning quite hard, because we use a range of different prices for commodities and for carbon to think about how our portfolio could unfold. The other important thing is the flexibility of the portfolio to enable us to make kind of decisions actually on a relatively kind of short time scale over kind of capital investments. And in some ways, the beauty about being in an oil and gas industry where there's natural decline, it gives you more choices. And so what happens is that our committed capital declines actually very quickly. Only kind of in 5 years hence, we have many choices that we can make about where we deploy that capital. And that could be into CCS, that could be into hydrogen, that could be into oil, that could be into gas, that could be into wind. So the flexibility of our portfolio is really important. And so we are able to say that our strategy is flexible enough to be able to be consistent with the stated goals of Paris, because that flexibility is there within the portfolio. Just putting it into a financial context, we invest about $15 to $17 billion a year capital investment. Our capital employed is about 150 billion. So roughly, you can kind of turn the firm over on a kind of 10-year basis. Similarly with kind of reserves to production ratios, ours are not very, very long dated. They're not multi-decadal. What we report to the SEC are reserves to production ratios of kind of 12 years or thereabouts. That's quite important. I think having these big elongated reserves to production ratios that used to be a big deal for the industry are unlikely to be so going forward. So with all of that, what we've chosen to kind of focus on is growing gas and advantage oil in the upstream. Now, what do we mean by that? Growing gas because gas is a robust fuel under many scenarios, including Paris, assuming some level of abatement, both of primary gas itself, but also of gas used in industry. And I know a lot of conversations have happened here around the use of CCUS, particularly for industrial abatement, where there frankly are very few other options in those hard-to-abate sectors like cement, like steel, and like petrochemicals. So it feels to us, however hard you try and push the energy transition to Paris without CCUS, you kind of can't do it. You have to have at least 5 gigatons worth of CCUS for industrial emissions, which are going to be extremely difficult to decarbonise otherwise. What do we mean by advantaged oil? That's really important. It's not oil that has kind of huge, kind of long-dated sort of production legs. This is oil that's going to pay back relatively quickly, that gives you a high degree of capital flexibility, and it's also oil that has low cost of supply. It's oil, to all intents and purposes, that can sit under that 40% of oil and gas production by 2040, i.e. sit under the kind of the requirements of Paris. Now you kind of say, well, surely you would say that, and many other companies will say that. But genuinely, there are kind of asset classes like kind of long-dated Arctic exploration, like capital intense and actually OPEX intense oil sand developments and others, which frankly just don't look right strategically under these kind of scenarios. The second one is our market-led growth approach in the downstream, which includes new market developments such as in Mexico, but also adding new opportunities for customers around retail and also around electrification. As you're probably aware, we just acquired ChargeMaster, the UK's biggest EV charging company, and are seeking to integrate that into our downstream business. The third component is the venturing in low carbon across multiple fronts. So that includes our existing alternative energy business, which is our US wind business, biofuels, and the recent investment we made in Lightsource BP, a solar company, which is actually proving to be actually very, very exciting and has gone from 3 countries to 11 countries since we joined forces with Lightsource. And then a whole range of different venturing activities that I'll come on to in a moment in 5 different areas. But underpinning all of that, it's actually about an attitude in the company, modernising the whole group. And that sounds kind of, well, what does that mean? It sounds like sort of waffle. But the reality is it's about doing things kind of faster. It's doing things in a more kind of agile way. It's about failing fast when you're looking at kind of new technologies, putting them to one side and moving on, and actually experimenting with new business models. It's not about the kind of, if you like, the usual kind of long-dated sort of capital exploration projects, and only that. That will still be a part of our portfolio, but it's about being able to move much more rapidly at its kind of essence. And a lot of that will be supported by and enabled by the kind of the digital kind of revolution that we are in the midst of at the moment. The way that manifests itself, particularly in the new business areas, are these 5 areas: advanced mobility. So this includes electrification and the ChargeMaster investment, plus a new investment called FreeWire and StoreDot in fast charging. It also includes looking at new mobility models and mobility as a service, as well as vehicle autonomy. So what impact could vehicle autonomy actually kind of make? And that's actually a really complicated subject. It's not intuitively obvious, so we're doing quite a bit of work on that. Bio and low carbon, around the use of primarily kind of waste biomass to develop new fuels and also municipal solid waste. A very interesting investment called Fulcrum Bioenergy that turns municipal solid waste into biojet, which has just broken ground in its second plant in the US. So you can imagine you could start to do some amazing things around taking MSW, and it's now more difficult to export that to the developing world who used to take it and dispose of it. But by using certain thermochemical technologies such as FT, you can turn that into useful long-chain waxes, which you can then start to cut up into biojet. So we're pretty excited about that. The other big area that's clearly deeply relevant geologically is around carbon management. So that includes carbon trading. That includes nature-based carbon offsets, which I think are still kind of underappreciated as an opportunity. It's almost like natural CCS. We think there's something like a 5 to 10 gigaton opportunity there. So we're going to be pushing quite hard on that. And of course, carbon capture, use and storage. The use bit will be perhaps 10% of the solution, but we still see the need for very large scale, as I mentioned, up to 5 gigatons by kind of the middle of the century of CCUS. At the moment, the reality is we've got about 17 projects globally and we're burying 30 million tons, so it doesn't even get to you. It's 2 orders of magnitude below where we need to be. And I know some people have spoken about the OGCI clean gas project, some of the other projects that some peer companies are doing, like Northern Lights. And last November in Edinburgh, there's a big CCUS summit, which Claire Perry and Fatih Birol hosted. And I think that could, for me, that's sort of marked a pivot point in kind of CCUS. I think this is now has to be taken much more seriously. But frankly, it's up to our industry to drive it. It's no good waiting for government policy to kind of to come to the rescue. We've got to be right at the front of it. Thank you. The other areas already mentioned, power and storage. So our solar business, plus also utility scale battery storage, looking into at the moment. And then the whole underpinnings of this kind of digital transformation. What I would mention on the slide, it says confidential. It isn't. This is all public domain information, and I just cocked up on the slide, so apologies for that. For the purposes of it being available more generally, we'll kind of take that out. None of this is confidential. And finally, just before I conclude, just to talk about a new framework that we introduced in April last year called Reduce, Improve and Create across BP, which again is trying to answer that third component of our strategy, which is around low carbon and venturing across multiple fronts. Taking action in our own operations, zero net growth in operational emissions of 2025. That's despite the fact we are growing the business by about 5% a year. 3.5 million tonnes of sustainable GHG emissions reductions, and also a very low methane intensity. This is amongst the best in peer group. And we think both of these targets we should be able to kind of achieve potentially ahead of time. So far the story is good. But it's quite amazing once you start putting targets out there, how it galvanizes and causes the organisation to do things in a very different and quite exciting way. Improving our products, and at the moment we haven't put any kind of targets against these. We are working on providing lower emissions gas and starting to create a tradable market in low emissions gas, potentially in the US. More efficient and lower carbon fuels, lubes and petchems. Again, that's just part of our offer to customers, and we see that as a growing part of the offer. And lower carbon offers for customers more generally through our target neutral programme. And I've mentioned most of these create new businesses. This 500 million is what we invest in alternative energy and these 5 new kind of venture areas. And we're collaborating in the Oil and Gas Climate Initiatives Fund that I'm sure you'll have heard about from earlier presentations. And underpinning all of that, we have a thing called Advancing Low Carbon, which is our internal accreditation scheme, which includes CCS projects, which includes carbon capture and use, which includes methane management. All these things can be accredited internally, and that actually is, again, proven to be quite a kind of a force for good within the organisation. So in conclusion, what we're trying to do is to, through advancing the energy transition, trying to take a clear approach with this kind of reduce, improve, create framework, those 5 focus areas that I mentioned a little bit earlier, spending this much money in a pretty strict financial framework. This isn't all the money we spend on low carbon. There's a lot of stuff that we do on methane management and kind of in efficiency across the businesses. But this is what we've said externally, and what we're planning to kind of spend. That may change. If it's going to go in any direction, it's going to grow over the coming years. So with that, I will button it, hand back to our moderator, and happy to take a couple of questions.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, a few quick questions for Dominic before we move on to the next session. Bryan at the back.
Dominic, it was January 1997, a mere 22 years ago, that Dr. David Jenkins, who's sitting down there on the left, sent a memo to the managing directors of BP suggesting that BP start taking climate change seriously. It was a remarkable memo, not least because, as David will explain, perhaps not now, he himself was far from convinced by the case then being made by the climate scientists. The history shows that in May 1997, John Bryan went to Stanford and became the first oil company chief, along with Mark Moody Stewart of Shell, to say that the company was going to take climate change seriously. We know what happened. It ran into the sand, and that policy, I'm delighted it's being restored. But it's going to come up against the same difficulties that Brown and his senior team were wrestling with all those years ago, which is how does this look to the investor? Now, I declare an interest. I'm advisor to BHP on climate change and CCS. In September 2015, before Paris, BHP became the first major resource company to publish an analysis of its portfolio that demonstrated that it could not only survive but could actually prosper with a carbon policy compatible with a 2-degree world. When is BP going to publish the equivalent document?
I'm going to say watch this space, and I'm also going to say that if you look in our annual report and look at our sustainability report, we do talk about our kind of the flexibility of our kind of strategy to a range of different scenarios. And that capital flexibility is really, really important. And I think the kind of traditional ways we've gone about analysing the impact of capital investments may actually be a kind of a thing of the past, or certainly something to improve upon. What we won't do is to publish a kind of a single deterministic view of the future and say we're going to align to that, because that is not an outcome consistent with the uncertainty that we're seeing in the world going forward. There are certain areas around which we feel quite confident will be important in the future, technologies and business models. For example, the use of biological kind of waste into heavy-duty transportation. We think that's a really good bet because, frankly, it's really hard to see any technologies that are going to be other than high-density liquid hydrocarbons to power flight or potentially for long-distance shipping. So we have to move in a kind of a way to create that, not through kind of fossil means, but through kind of alternative means. So that could be synthetic fuels, but it could also be biofuels, but not biofuels based on large amounts of kind of on-purpose kind of feedstocks that could potentially displace food. That's another big kind of if you like, boundary issue for us. The other area is around hydrogen, and we're getting increasingly excited about the opportunity for hydrogen. I know Equinor are here and actually made some very substantial and really forward-leaning commitments into hydrogen. We see natural gas, as potentially a kind of a transition fuel en route to hydrogen into the future. And so we see, again, that as possibly quite a sensible kind of bet going forward, notwithstanding some of the challenges, mostly for kind of industrial deployment. Whether residential deployment works for heat remains to be seen. The other areas that are kind of more opaque are kind of heavy-duty kind of on-road. So that could go a number of ways. It could go biomass, but is there enough of it? It could go hydrogen, or it could go electric. It's not obvious how that space is going to emerge, and so we don't want to put too many big bets on heavy-duty on-road at the moment. But the other big areas are CCS, and I think the industry has now really woken up to the importance of it and how we can play a role, not necessarily in sustaining hydrocarbons, but actually in supporting kind of a CCUS industry for industrial CO2 emissions. The final thing I'll mention, the other big component, is actually carbon natural sinks and the importance of kind of propagating natural sinks. So I think between those kind of, and as well as renewable power, which in some ways we kind of think is a bit of a given, it's just going to happen, those are the kind of big technologies that we think are going to kind of be the winning way, without making big bets and big choices anytime soon, because frankly, when we did that in alternative energy, we went too early and were disappointed at least two of the technologies. That's a long-winded answer, Bryan.
Another quick question.
Yes.
We are slightly behind time.
John Gibbons, UK CCS Research Centre. A bit more about CCS. So you say you think the progressing CCUS is progressing it for industry, and I guess for hydrogen. Is that right? Not for electricity.
I would say yes. I think our mind has changed quite a bit. I think the idea that CCUS for power, because the relative lack of the cost reductions that we've seen in solar and wind, and also the cost reductions we're seeing in battery storage, and the cost reductions we're seeing broadly in power integration into systems, I think mean that CCS into power will become kind of, there's space for it for sure, but I don't think it's going to be the big demander for CCUS. I think it's going to be industrial emissions and potentially for hydrogen as we generate blue hydrogen, and there's also going to be a lot of space for green hydrogen from renewable electrolysis as well.
Thank you very much. Great.
Thanks very much.